Cool. Okay, so legal highs have brought a large amount of untested chemicals to the UK high street. Is that of concern to Drugscope?
I mean, Drugscope's view on all of this is that there's always going to be an inherent problem with drugs that change the way you feel, that alter your perception of the world, because there is a kind of perception that legal equals safe, and that's often how they're sold. And I suspect that some of them may well be chemically safer than other substances. But the problem is that, and as with illegal drugs, whether it's cannabis or ecstasy or whatever, probably the majority of people who try these things out are not necessarily going to come to any great harm. But the problem always is for people who are in some way vulnerable to the effects of these drugs, whether they're ecstasy and amphetamine based, which is a lot. Most of them are have got that kind of buzz around them. Some of them are a little bit more what you might call soporific, I suppose, which is a little bit more of the cannabis feel to them, like spice is the latest one in that category. I wouldn't say Drugscope is tremendously worried about any of this, but there's always a concern about the effects on vulnerable people. The fact that, like illicit drugs, even though there might be legal highs, you still don't know what's in it. A lot of the manufacturers are fairly cagey about what goes in them, because often they're kind of one or two tweaks away from an illicit drug. So they don't particularly want you to know what's in them, presumably for commercial reasons or whatever. So there's still an issue of kind of buyer beware about all of this stuff, and you certainly can't rely on what's written on the label, if anything is.
That's interesting. You talked about the crossover there between legal and illegal. Is there a worry that perhaps people are going to get into it through legal drugs and then transfer into illegal ones?
I don't think there's much evidence of people doing that. I mean, I think people are probably trying these things, because they are legal, and it avoids you getting into the kind of general problem of trying to buy drugs on the street and all that could involve. So I doubt very much whether legal highs are a gateway drug to illicit drug. And I suspect also that people who are regular users of legal highs probably use the other illegal stuff as well. It's often just a question of what's available and what you can get your hands on.
And is this legal high kind of industry, I mean, there seems to be a lot out there at the moment, and obviously a lot of press attention. Do you think that this is a kind of recent development, the really widespread of legal highs? And obviously in the sense it's been around for years, but there seems to be a...
I mean, there are various reasons, I suspect, because of that. I mean, the police enforcement agencies have had quite a lot of success in cutting, in combating the manufacture and distribution of what they call precursor chemicals. The chemicals that are used to make drugs. The best example of that being LSD. There's very little LSD produced. In fact, Britain used to be quite a major producer of LSD in the 70s. And the laws around the precursor chemicals, they've clamped down on those. And so that's clearly, so therefore people have for some while now, been looking for different ways of getting around that. And either it's drugs that are like, say, poppers, ketamine, that kind of stuff. Well, ketamine was technically a legal high until fairly recently. GHB was a legal high until fairly recently. But the chemists are looking for slightly more diverse ways of getting around the drug laws. Obviously, the internet has been another factor in all of this in terms of marketing and distribution, which wouldn't have been available even 5 or 6 years ago. So I think the trying to stay one jump ahead of the law and having more diverse ways of distribution are probably at least a good chunk of the reason why they've become so popular.
And does that make it, do you think, easier for them to evade legislation, because as you say, the sort of underground chemists are doing a better job of coming up with new forms of it, and you have the internet as well.
It's going to make it difficult. It's going to make it difficult. It's inevitable that, that there's a lot of publicity now around mephedrone, which is kind of an ecstasy type drug, spice, which seems to be a cannabis type drug. Once the law kicks in, which it inevitably will, I mean, as soon as these things pop up on the radar and people start writing about it and all the rest of it, legislation is going to be fairly swiftly going to follow. And so they'll come up with something else.
Do you think it's always the case that the legislation will follow fairly swiftly? So we've come across the BZP drug, which was obviously sort of around in the 90s, came from New Zealand, and then and the EU kicked the government into action, and it's still legal. Yes,
I doubt it will be legal for much longer though. It wouldn't surprise me if sometime this year there was a recommendation and an acceptance that it needed to be controlled. I'd be very surprised if this government got a recommendation to control a drug and decided not to. That would almost be without precedent. So I'm sure it'll happen.
But I mean, if there is a perception that legal means safe, and these drugs remain legal for a long time while there's a sort of legislative delay, that doesn't seem like a very desirable situation. I mean, do you think the government are being slow, or do you think?
I think it depends. I mean, you take someone like the Home Office. I mean, BZP. There's no way that you could put your hand on your heart and say that this was a drug that's causing widespread problems in society. So it's just a question of legislative priorities, I would imagine, and often I suspect with some of these substances it's more a question of trying to shut the door before the horse is bolted rather than afterwards. So they're precautionary measures. I think they're precautionary measures, certainly with legal highs, as opposed to a response to a problem. And therefore, because it's not a response to an actual problem, the political driver to act quickly isn't quite there. As if 50 people have suddenly died as a result of taking BZP, I suspect the government have acted pretty damn quick.